Are there any questions for the morning session? No questions. So, thank you, Larry.
Larry Schulman from the University of Pennsylvania. Hetty, you very nicely outlined really what is a dichotomy, about how complicated things are getting, and yet how few radiology specialists there are distributed around the country. And data would suggest that those things are probably going to continue to diverge. Our technology will get more complex, better, but more difficult to interpret. And the volume of X-rays and other data is going to increase. So, you talked a lot about what you might call augmented intelligence, ways to help the clinician, whether it's a radiologist or a pathologist, provide a level of expertise that's not currently available. You also showed the rereading slide of how many times decisions are changed based on rereading at expert centers. So I'm still having a hard time, very frankly, imagining what the road forward is going to be, so that if we run this workshop again in 5 years, that we will be better off and not worse off the way things are going. And, what's your pragmatic answer to that?
So I don't think anybody has an answer right now. I think that number one is what our first workshop did, I believe, is to point out, to make people aware of the problems. I think that comes with every diagnosis. You have to acknowledge that there are symptoms, and then you go see a doctor. Some people, as you know, sometimes we wonder, why do we see a patient at such a late stage, yet the breast cancer is all you have, it's palpable, it's visible, and they think it's going to go away. So I think number one was really awareness of the importance. Second, problems of lack of education. Oncologic imaging is not general image, it's just not. The reading the films visually, 10 years from now, let's say 10 years, I'm looking at my experts, 5 to 10 years of now will be replaced by machine learning. Saying there is a cancer in the lab, whatever. The nodule of this speculated, that measurement. I don't think it will give you it will give you differential. But the reading or putting the visual findings together will be replaced by machine learning. I hope so. I'm looking for experts to confirm that I'm right. So at that point, the role of radiologist will change. And that will be to put those findings together and be a consultant. So I think that machine learning will force our specialty to change and accept that we are not film readers, but we are physicians that offer the diagnosis. So I actually think I'm an optimist. So I think that machine learning and all this will help. And then also, as you know, in a cancer care, majority of our time is spent measuring tumors and comparing the tumors. That we spend huge amount. To read a CT properly with a prior studies, and you cannot, for those of you in the audience that understand cancer care, you cannot compare just with the study 6 months ago because you'll make mistakes. So we have a rule of 2 previous studies. That takes you half an hour. If that can be done by a machine in a minute or 2 minutes, just think the time I save that I can then use to really use my intellect and then decide what kind of response it is. So I think the workflow through machine learning will improve. I think standardization will improve across the board because you can't miss something because machine learning will say, zingy, zingy, I'm right here. So you can't miss it, so that it will be standardized, it will be much faster, and it will force people to learn oncology and understand oncologic imaging.
So I think that's a great summary, and I agree with essentially everything you said with one caveat.
Yes.
Which is, and maybe this might be self-serving, but I don't think we're going to replace the human beings as part of the process entirely in this. And I think, Memorial has had a lot of experience with IBM Watson, for instance, and there are other, similar experiments where, the question is, can IBM Watson beat you at chess or some other games? And the answer really still is there is a place for the human being in all of this. I think the efficiency is critical, and we will have a forum here in this room in February where we're going to be looking at the oncology care force, and the only solution to that is exactly what you're saying, which is to improve both the efficiency and the accuracy of how we do our work. But I don't think you and I will be put out of business.
Oh, no, especially not me. No, sorry if I misspoke. Absolutely not. The radiologists, those that survive the change are going to be critical members of the team of cancer care. And sorry for being so shrewd, but I was there when CT started, when many radiologists said, who needs this? I'm doing barium enema or apogee. I do fluoro. I don't want this. This is nothing. Those that didn't adopt perished. And that's luckily they are usually in a different generation. And luckily they just don't want to be a part of that change. But those that do want to be a part of the change, the future is actually better. That's in short, right?
Can I make a comment on that, Dr. Schulman? When I started using the computational modeling of genomic data, so this is in parallel pathology data, and we started using that at my institution in a couple clinical trials, we would provide the computational report and the protein network map to our oncologists and say, the answer is this chemotherapy. The reflex response from the clinical oncologist was, oh, tell me more about this pathway. And physicians are curious, and they're also skeptical. I wouldn't say distrustful, and you know this. So the medical oncologist is curious about the biology as much about the patient. And we actually found that providing the computational report almost increased the amount of time that it took to come to an answer to a patient because we provided the inside guts of what was going on, which piqued the curiosity. So we may I would submit that we may actually see some inefficiencies in the system by providing information that's computationally interpreted because of the curiosity that it invokes.
But don't you think that's a part of the learning curve?
Yes.
Yeah. So down the line, it will be more streamlined. Plus, also, we'll have, Mr. Chu, aren't you going to join us, Dr. Chu, at the day? No, because we need you. Don't you think that integrated diagnostics will be a reality? It better be.
My sense is a great promise, but I think we have to be careful that, as we've seen from popular reporting, a lot depends on the data that you use to train the algorithms with. And we could inject biases that we don't understand. So I'm back to the human element being important. I think the diagnostician is going to be critical in seeing patterns that the machine learning will not necessarily turn up.
Okay. Sorry. Yes, go ahead, please.
Again, I share the enthusiasm about machine learning. I'm Frank
Please
Wyckoff
introduce
from
yourself.
Food and Drug Administration,
Yeah.
FDA. I work in the Office of the Chief Scientist. The excitement about machine learning is certainly, with digital revolution, that's great. However, let's not forget, first of all, we have to train machines and we have to validate. And I think that's where we are struggling the most right now, because we do not even understand the evidence that we are using to feed machines, because we don't have the opportunity to link it back to the source data. So if we stipulate and train AI and we don't have a clear understanding of the strength of the evidence, I think we quickly build air castles, or whatever you want to call this. So I think that's where the community has to come together and agree on metadata standards that we can use to have the underpinning for building strong AI.
I am not a computer expert. Actually, I'm proud to be ignorant. But this is why when IBM Watson came to Memorial and Larry in radiology wasn't a part of this, because they wanted unsupervised machine learning process. There's no way that you can do unsupervised at this point. At this point, for the beginning at least, you do need to outline every tumor and then check and double check and go back. So I absolutely agree with you that for the beginning, machine learning in the rare, every specialty has its own pros and cons. For radiology, for the beginning, and I would love to hear from experts, but I think that unsupervised learning in radiology for the beginning is a dangerous road. This is just logic. That has nothing to do with knowledge of computers, because every time we have a new technology, you have to have gold standard to really understand the accuracy of technology. So I apply the same logic to computer learning. Well, right, wrong?
Correct. It's like teaching a medical student. We're teaching cameras and computers to diagnose blood cancers at the University of Florida. And I agree with you completely that you have to know the source. We scraped the internet for images first, and it was a disaster, because you're absolutely right. You don't know for certain what the diagnosis is, and there's so many variations of. So we started, I have a student team that is taking high-res images using microscopes and cameras that we have at our institute, and I know the cases, and I can attest to what they are with a pathologist as well. It's incredibly laborious and it's slow and painstaking, but it's worth it when the confidence is high. You're absolutely right. It's like teaching a medical student.
Yeah. No, we are interested. Yeah,
Hi,
please.
Lee Newcomer. Chris, first of all, you missed a career as a graphic artist if those are your slides.
Yeah.
They're really good. Talk to me a little bit about what the level of proof or evidence ought to be for the kinds of computational algorithms you were showing or demonstrating for AML and MDS. Is a randomized trial using that logic versus standard of care enough, or do we need to think about even something as complex as an FDA regulatory mechanism for those algorithms?
Lee, that's a great question, and I think it's the question for the entire workshop. Is at what level do we have reasonable expectation that this technology, whatever it is of that's being developed, is ready for prime time? That's the question. When we started developing the one that we're using at the University of Florida, there wasn't a lot of guidance, and we just saw examples of app developers, and that were many of them which were flaming out, and some of them that were succeeding, and some which have been mentioned earlier that had a very robust marketing force, but not a lot behind it, from our impression. So our review at the FDA was very informative, not only providing some guidance on level of rigor for approval, but also in what wasn't known and where there wasn't guidance at the time. And this was about a year and a half ago. A lot's happened since. And we look forward to hearing from the FDA at this workshop about what guidances are now available. So I've modeled a lot of what we do based off of my drug development experience, to be honestly. I looked to ASCO. Dr. Shilsky, ASCO, your working groups have done a really good job of being critical about precision technologies, namely in vitro diagnostics. And one of the main criticisms that ASCO's task force groups have is that the data is weak. There's no strong correlation with survival outcomes with patients. And specifically, they make that point because there are some companies that are doing very good work on in vitro diagnostics, but the working group at ASCO felt like that wasn't strong enough.
Thanks.
Now, I don't know if we need survival data as a green light for technology. And as the FDA knows, there's surrogates for survival, like in some cancers, morphologic response is enough. The way that I'm doing it with the companies I work with in academia is we do cell line data first. If we have no goes, then we proceed to retrospective data. If the company can analyze retrospective data in a masked manner successfully, then we go to a prospective pilot study. If in a pilot study it's feasible, then we go to a randomized phase 2. And that's been the stepwise that I've been moving. It's much to the chagrin of investors on boards who are saying, no, we want our ROI now. But that's how we see it as responsible succession.
That's a drug development model.
It is a drug development model. That's absolutely right. I don't know if that's right or not, but that's for this workshop to weigh in on.
I know it's probably a comment that it's not a part of this workshop, but I think it is very important as we develop different algorithms, and it's almost for FDA. If we only agree on survival data, we are not going to make much progress in technology. The reason is if you want to, sure, we have databases, but the quality of the images and the details we saw 10, 15 years ago doesn't compare to today. So therefore, the historical data for technology just don't work. And I think that one of the things that this community will really need to take risk, but survival data for technology development perhaps are not really feasible.
Hi, this is Bakul Patel from FDA. I head up the digital health work at FDA at CDRH. Actually, I'm going to just piggyback on your comment. I think we're on an era I'll make a comment and I have a question for the panel. The comment is, I think we are looking at different, I'll use the word ground truth loosely, but I think we're in the era of looking at different ground truths, because I think even Chris, when you just introduced the topic this morning, you had 4 options, and there's something that we practice today is a choice. And then everything else that you had on that table or the list of 4 things was data-driven. So the question is, what we think about data standards of our ground truth, the golden standard that we have today, is it still comparable when you now have a very rich set of information that we may not have seen or seen before? So how do we think about that? And the question is, as one of the opportunities that we have with AI and machine learning is the opportunity to improve that, what we used to consider ground truth or golden standard. How do we go about thinking about that? And when you talk about risks, what does that mean for risk taken by you guys who know that there is some risk and there is one thing, and then risk taken by somebody who doesn't know what risk they're taking is a challenge for FDA. So how do you sort of balance that out, and what rules of the road we should set up? Those are the things that we are thinking about at the agency to figure out as we try to look for competitors in the AI and machine learning world. What should we look for, and is there a period of time where we are learning together as a community? So just questions for you guys.
I can take a
I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that question. I think one standard to apply, I would argue, is analogous to what VA did with quality of care after World War II, which was to marry the academic establishment. And so I think one standard out there is to use the academic establishment as your test of whether the vendor's for-profit incentive is clouding his or her vision of what is really an effective tool. In essence, it's a peer review kind of model that you might turn to. Because yes, there is a great deal of misapplication of these tools and results that would not be reliable and create risks for all concerned in terms of their utilization. So I'm a little worried about the free-form app situation that was described in the last presentation, because you may have products that create results that are not accurate and not helpful. And so I think thinking about the academic establishment as your partner in this and as the validator, that if they don't have an academic partner who is essentially certifying their results, including the quality of the data that were used for the development in the first place, I think you'd be missing a big opportunity.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead, please.
So my name is Nick Petrick. I'm from the FDA as well. My question is, what's the thought process associated with trying to train clinicians or medical personnel to interact with AI? In some sense, if AI takes over and does the job for the clinician, of course, that's pretty straightforward. More than likely, though, it's going to be an interactive tool with the clinician. And again, with all the questions about how to use AI, how to use it effectively, what's sort of the thought process around how to train clinicians to really interact with it well, to understand where there are limitations associated with it, to understand that when you look at an image, it may tell you something about a lesion on that image, but without knowing the full clinical context to it, you have to take that into account. And so I'm just wondering what the thought process might be around that.
That's why we call it augmented intelligence and not artificial. And you are absolutely right. And that's when Larry asked a question, I actually think our future is brighter because it will help you point to the system, but the final decision is human. How do you train? That's up to Chris.
In this learning curve, when we introduced augmented intelligence to physicians that I work with, the first few weeks, there was actually an ego response where, no, I know this better than the computer. And that's a pretty thick veneer. And I say that being a card-carrying oncologist with an ego. So to have another entity come in and say that they know better, you have to get through that. And so whatever app or AI service is available, they're going to have to integrate this in a very friendly way, is one. Secondly, it gets to the other question from the other FDA employees, to let the doctor know that this technology can actually help in choosing among what might be standard choices. That's another thing. So I think a lot of people think that AI is going to show you, to take, cucumber juice, or something, completely wild. But actually, it can help you play your odds. It can help you at that blackjack table to figure out what, whether you should hit or stay, or that's, my experience is that the learning curve was 6 months. It took 6 months to get medical oncologists to accept genomic interpretation by computers about what therapies have certain likelihoods of responding or not responding. 6 months, and even then there was still some curiosity and reticence, but not as high as it was during the first 6 months.
I do think this raises an interesting question about the medical school curriculum, where statistics and data analytics have never, in my experience, been a feature of most curricular patterns. And so I do think the issue is how it's not the clinician is going to become the AI expert. It's that you want the clinician, it seems to me, to be an intelligent consumer of what is being offered. And so the issue for the medical schools, it seems to me, is how do you prepare the next generation of clinicians to deal intelligently with these opportunities, and what kind of development in their training would be helpful in that regard?
And can I make a point on that, just to follow Dr. Chu? I sent out an army of undergrads and medical students at my institute to sit in on every medical school lecture and internal medicine residency lecture with their smartphone stopwatches. And I asked them to record how much time that every lecture spends talking about anything with genetics, genomics, and interpretation of. And the average amount of time was 2 minutes or less per lecture, if at all. So you're absolutely right, Dr. Chu. We're still teaching, late 1990s, early 2000s medicine, and I think the med ed component will be an important conclusion from this workshop.
Yes. Thank you. That was really excellent point. Yeah, that goes. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I want to loop back a couple of comments because I jumped up after. Oh, sorry, Keith Flaherty from Mass General, medical oncologist. I'll be speaking in the next group of speakers, but these comments are totally adjacent to the point that points that I'm going to raise there. So I jumped up after Lee Newcomer's comment because sort of a soapbox point of mine in general is that being a medical oncologist, this is maybe predictable, that half of what we need going forward are new therapeutics, like new mechanisms, new drugs, things that we don't have at all. I'll make that point, I guess, in my talk a little bit later. Half of what we need is diagnostics. And yet the path to testing and adoption, and then like approval being a rare site on the diagnostic side is so fundamentally different than the therapeutic side. This is well known to this group, but I just want to kind of, at least at this point in the workshop, kind of make this perhaps obvious point. Of the long list of disclosures that I'll show in a few minutes when I get up to speak, one of them is not that I receive a paycheck from FDA. And so I will make this point. We need either regulation of LDTs, as has been talked about now a fair bit in the past few years, but hasn't really occurred. We need to establish a bar, really any bar, for how diagnostic tests need to perform. Then we need to raise that bar, and we actually need to aspire as a field, at least in cancer, to have LDTs become approved tests. So companion diagnostics are already taken care of, right? Because the drug won't get there without the diagnostic. So therapy-owning biotech and pharma companies will embrace companion diagnostics. But any other form of diagnostic, and particularly ones that come post-approval of the initial therapy, we have a woefully inadequate system for how to develop and establish those therapies. So ex vivo functional diagnostics are one category, and so you nicely pointed out, Chris, in your comments, that it was up to ASCO to take a bunch of small phase 2-ish looking results, from decades and years past, and say, yeah, this doesn't measure up. This doesn't. This is not a level of evidence. Well, you would do the same for a 14-patient phase 2 trial, right? You would say, well, that's not enough to actually make it onto the NCCN guidelines / change practice on the treatment side. So my point being, we just have an incredibly uneven playing field in terms of how we think about the rigor with which therapeutics are advanced versus diagnostics.
Our time is up, but let's do one question. Would you like to ask a question?
Sure. Stan Gerson from the Case Comprehensive Cancer Center in Cleveland. I was curious in the presentation by Atul, which hasn't been followed up here, on his recognition of the Cancer Consortium of basically the state of California, which provided data on 144,000 cancer patients. That's a large real-world data set. Is that aggregate likely to be useful for decision tree determinations, for drug review and approvals as real-world data, or is it just too premature to consider that as reliable data? I'm sort of curious about the comments.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think we need to be thinking larger than that. So California is not unique. There are other states that have consortiums. In Florida, we have a One Florida consortium where we have over 10 million Floridians out of our state population of 20 million. So we have half the state population in a informatics registry. And we have their data. You can get various forms of identification depending on your IRB approval. There are other states that are developing consortia like that. I think we need to think bigger and see if we can, if we want to get at asking questions that require large sample sizes, let's think bigger and about joining these state consortia into something even larger. It's because it's dry data, it's possible. So when you have large, very large sample size like that, yes, there'll be noise, but there will be also signal in the more rare circumstances as well, especially like, for example, cholangiocarcinoma, which is incredibly difficult to treat, and the biology is woefully lacking, and our understanding of the biology is woefully lacking. That's where we can make great advances is in these refractory and very rare cancers. I say let's think bigger than just state consortium.
On that note, thank you all very much. There is a break now, and then please, we'll ring the bell, but it's about 15 minutes coffee break. Thank you.